The boy they fought over was the one who ended it, leaving one sister dead, the other mad, and a beautiful dream to rot in the Louisiana sun. That is the epitaph of Belle Rêve, the final brutal sentence in a story that was never meant for the pages of a romance novel. But to understand the blood on the floor and the madness in the garden, we must go back. We must go back to the silence that came before the storm, to the quiet, simmering poison that grew in a house where two lonely women decided a single human heart was a thing to be owned. Our story begins, as it ends, in the heart of Louisiana's sugar country, on a plantation called Belle Rêve. The name meant beautiful dream, but by 1849, the dream had turned feverish. The once grand manor, a white-columned queen of the bayou, was in a state of slow, elegant decay. The heat and the humidity, relentless lovers, were reclaiming her. Paint peeled from the verandas like sunburnt skin, and the gardens, once laid out with a mathematician's precision, now grew with the wild, desperate beauty of a forgotten memory. The air was a thick perfume of jasmine and rot, a scent that clung to your clothes and settled in your lungs, a constant reminder that in this land, life and decay were inseparable. Inside this decaying dream lived the Devereaux sisters, Eleonora and Isabelle. They were the last of their name, the final pale moths fluttering in the gilded cage their father's debts had left behind. Cholera, a swift and merciless visitor, had claimed their parents 2 years prior, leaving the sisters with the crumbling house, the fallow land, and a single servant bound to their personal service, a boy named Samuel. Eleonora, the elder by 5 years, was the self-appointed warden of the ruin. She was a woman carved from duty and bone, plain in a way that seemed more a choice than a circumstance. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a severe knot, and her dresses were always practical, dark, and impeccably maintained. She moved through the shadowed halls with the quiet, rigid purpose of a chess piece, her mind a constant battlefield of numbers that no longer added up, of ledgers filled with loss. She fought the slow, graceful collapse of her heritage with a grim, loveless devotion. Eleonora saw Belle Rêve not for the husk it was, but for the glorious memory it had been, and her love for that memory was fierce, brittle, and cold. Isabelle was her opposite, a creature of light and air trapped in the same gilded cage. She was the beauty of the family, the one who had inherited their mother's delicate porcelain features and their father's poetic, tragic soul. Where Eleonora saw the hard lines of reality, Isabelle saw the soft focus of romance. She lived in a world of novels and whispered verses, her days spent not in the dusty study, but wandering the overgrown gardens, a lonely, waiting heroine in a story only she was reading. For her, the decay of Belle Rêve wasn't a failure. It was a tragic backdrop, the perfect melancholic stage for a great love to bloom. And between them, the fulcrum upon which their opposing worlds balanced was Samuel. At 17, he was on the cusp of manhood, tall and slender, with a quiet, innate grace that seemed out of place in a house of such decay. He had been born on the plantation, a fixture of the house as much as the cypress floorboards and the tarnished silver. But it was his eyes that set him apart. Dark, intelligent, and perpetually watchful, they seemed to see more than he ever let on, absorbing the silent, emotional currents of the house. He was their father's last gift, or perhaps his last burden, deeded to the sisters jointly for their personal care in a will that bound him as surely as any chain. He was shared property. The mornings belonged to Eleonora. In the tomb-like silence of the study, he would assist her in her fight against time. He learned to mend the crumbling spines of books with a surgeon's care, to polish the remaining family silver until it shone with a ghostly light. He was silent, efficient, obedient.
In these quiet hours, Eleonora would find her stern gaze lingering on him. He was order in her chaos. He was diligence in her world of decay. He was the one beautiful, functional thing she had left to control, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth would stir in the cold chambers of her heart, the dangerous warmth of possession. The afternoons belonged to Isabelle. She would lead him away from the shadows of the house and into the wild, sun-drenched gardens. There, on a weathered stone bench, she would have him read aloud from her books of poetry, Keats, Shelley, Byron. His voice was low and steady, a calming melody against the drone of the cicadas. He read words he was forbidden to learn for himself, of loves and freedoms he could never know. In these languid hours, Isabelle would watch the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way the light caught the lines of his face, and her romantic heart would begin to beat a dangerous rhythm. He was her confidant, her audience, the noble, unsung hero of her own private novel.
For a time, this fragile ecosystem of shared affection held, but knowing where this path leads, we can see the poison in both forms of love. Eleonora's was a love of control, the desire to keep a beautiful object safe on a shelf. Isabelle's was a love of fantasy, the desire to cast a living person as a character in her story. Neither saw the boy, they saw only a reflection of their own profound loneliness. The first crack in the silence was a book. Isabelle, in a gesture of profound intimacy and recklessness, gave Samuel a small, worn copy of Keats as a secret gift. It was an invitation into her world, a dangerous whisper of equality. Eleonora found it during a routine inspection of his small room off the kitchen. She didn't confront him. The book was not his crime, it was Isabelle's. She found her sister arranging flowers in the parlor, her movements graceful and serene. Eleonora held the book out, not with a flourish, but with a quiet, deadly stillness. "What is this?" Eleonora's voice was a low whisper, more dangerous than any shout. Isabelle's smile faltered. "It is a book of poetry." "I know what it is," Eleonora hissed, taking a step closer. "It is a fantasy. It is a poison. You are filling his head with impossible things. He is a servant, Isabelle, not your plaything. He has duties." "He has a soul," Isabelle countered, her eyes flashing with a sudden fire. "Something you seem to forget when you are polishing your silver and counting your losses. He is more of a man than any you will find in your dusty ledgers." They were not fighting over a book. They were fighting over a soul. And in that moment, the house chose its sides. The shadows seemed to deepen around Eleonora, while the light from the window seemed to cling to Isabelle. Samuel, the subject of their war, was not even in the room, but his fate was being decided. The unspoken rivalry was now a declared one. Love, in the suffocating heat of Belle Rêve, had curdled into a quiet, vicious contest. The question was no longer simply about which sister would win his affection, but what would be left of the boy when the victor finally claimed her prize. The declaration of war in the parlor did not lead to shouts and screams. At Belle Rêve, the deepest wounds were inflicted in silence. The house, already heavy with the scent of decay, now grew thick with a new poison, the sisters' calculated, obsessive jealousy. Their shared affection for Samuel had been a fragile peace treaty. Its violation now plunged them into a cold war, fought on the battlefield of the boy's daily life. He was no longer a person to them, but a territory to be conquered. His heart the flag to be captured, and his soul the price of victory. Eleonora, in her desperate, almost pathological need for control, weaponized duty.
Her love was a cage, and she began to meticulously reinforce its bars. She systematically dismantled the old schedule, erasing the hours that had once belonged to Isabelle. The afternoons in the garden were the first to go. She invented endless, meaningless chores, each one a stone laid on the path between Samuel and her sister. He was made to recatalog the entire library, a task that took weeks, his days spent in the dusty, tomb-like silence with Eleonora as his constant, watchful shadow. She had him inventory every piece of china, every tarnished spoon, every threadbare napkin in the house. Her cruelty was cloaked in the language of stewardship. "An idle mind is a dangerous thing, Samuel," she would say, her voice deceptively calm as she ran a white-gloved finger over a surface he had just polished. "Ms. Isabel's fantasies have made you soft. We must rebuild your sense of purpose." Her presence was a heavy, suffocating blanket of possession. She would stand near him as he worked, not speaking, just watching, her gaze a physical weight. In her twisted logic, she was saving him from the false hope and romantic nonsense that Isabelle represented. To Eleonora, keeping him busy was keeping him safe, keeping him hers. Isabelle, robbed of her afternoons, her world shrinking, fought back with the only weapon she had, the clandestine thrill of romance. If Eleonora was building a prison of duty, Isabelle would offer a key forged from fantasy. She became a creature of stolen moments and secret gestures. Her love was an illicit secret, a beautiful, dangerous dream they were meant to share against all odds. She began to leave things for him to find. A single perfect gardenia pressed between the pages of a ledger he was meant to file. A line of poetry scrawled on a scrap of paper tucked into his folded laundry. Each discovery was a jolt, a reminder of a world that existed outside Eleonora's rigid control. She would steal moments with him, her appearances sudden and fleeting, her whispers urgent. A brief, daring touch of her hand on his as they passed in a shadowed hallway. A hushed meeting on the moonlit veranda after Eleonora had retired for the night. Her words were a potent, intoxicating poison of their own. "She wants to crush the light in you, Samuel," Isabelle would murmur, her eyes wide and earnest in the darkness. "She wants to turn you into another one of her dusty, lifeless relics. But I see you. I see the poet in your soul. Don't let her extinguish you." She sold him a vision of a future, a beautiful, impossible escape. "There are places, north of here, places where a man like you can be free, where we could be free." Samuel was being torn apart. To obey Eleonora's endless, stifling commands was a betrayal of the hope Isabelle offered. To accept Isabelle's clandestine gifts and conspiratorial whispers was a defiance of the woman who held the legal papers to his life. He moved through his days with the careful, measured steps of a man walking on a wire suspended over a chasm. The emotional trauma began to etch itself onto his features. The quiet light in his watchful eyes dimmed, replaced by a weary, hunted look. He was not a lover being courted. He was a pawn in a game whose rules he did not understand, played by two queens who would sacrifice anything to win. The turning point, the moment the Cold War turned hot and the house could no longer contain the fire, came on the night of the summer storm. The sky had been a bruised, angry purple all day, promising a violence that the humid air could no longer hold. As evening fell, the heavens broke open. Rain lashed against the windows in furious sheets, and the wind moaned through the eaves of the old house like a grieving spirit. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a perfect reflection of the turmoil within Belle Rêve. That evening, Eleonora was in the study, a single lamp pushing back the oppressive darkness, a glass of sherry untouched at her elbow. She had been waiting for Samuel to bring her a shawl for over an hour. He was late. Every minute that passed, every tick of the clock, stoked the fires of her jealousy into a raging inferno. She knew where he was. Isabelle had intercepted him. She had drawn him into the conservatory, a glass-walled room at the back of the house that was her personal sanctuary. With the storm raging, it felt like being inside a ship tossed on a tempestuous sea. The overgrown jasmine vines pressed against the panes, their white flowers like ghostly faces in the flashes of lightning. The air was thick with the scent of rain, damp earth, and blooming flowers. It was the most romantic, most dangerous place in Belle Rêve. "She doesn't love you," Isabelle whispered, her voice a desperate, urgent plea over the roar of the rain. She stood so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her, see the storm reflected in her pleading eyes. "She loves the idea of you, a perfect, silent object who will never leave her. I love you, Samuel, the man you are, the man you could be." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch both a comfort and a brand. "Run away with me, tonight. We can be gone before morning. We could go north, to a place where you could be free, where we could be free." It was a fantasy, a beautiful, impossible dream woven from poetry and desperation. But in that moment, with the storm as their witness and her touch a promise against his skin, it felt real. Samuel, for the first time in his life, allowed himself to hope. He leaned into her touch, his weary resolve, worn down by weeks of emotional torment, finally beginning to crumble. At that exact moment, the door to the conservatory creaked open. Eleonora stood there, framed in the doorway, the lamp from the study held high in her hand like a holy relic or a weapon. The light cast long, monstrous shadows that danced on the walls, and her face was a pale, stark mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She had seen it all. The intimacy, the touch, the ultimate betrayal. "So," Eleonora's voice was unnervingly calm, a frozen lake of rage that was far more terrifying than any shout. "This is what diligence looks like, whispering with my sister in the dark while I suffer the chill alone." Isabelle spun around, dropping her hands, but her defiance remained. "He is not a machine, Eleonora. He is a man with a heart, and you are trying to crush it." "And you would save it?" Eleonora took a step into the room, the lamplight throwing their shadows into a chaotic, violent dance. "You would offer him a life on the run, a fantasy built on stolen books and foolish dreams? You would see him hunted, tracked by dogs, and hanged from a tree, all for your selfish, childish romance?" The sisters faced each other, their lifelong resentments and newfound jealousies finally laid bare, spitting venom in the flickering light. Samuel stood between them, frozen, the beautiful hope that had bloomed moments before, now withering under the heat of their hatred. But it was what Eleonora said next that sealed all their fates. Her eyes, cold and hard as river stones, moved from her sister and settled on Samuel. The words she spoke were not to Isabelle, but to him. They were the ultimate act of possession, the final, devastating move in her cruel game. "You seem to have forgotten your place, Samuel," she said, her voice dripping with the ice of absolute authority. You are not a man to be wooed. You are property, my property. And tomorrow I will be taking a trip to New Orleans. There is a man there, a Mr. Dubois, who runs a sugar refinery. He is always looking for strong young bucks for the cane fields. They say the work will break a man's back in 2 years. I will have the papers of sale drawn up in the morning."
The shocking revelation fell into the room like an executioner's axe. It was a death sentence. To be sold south to the cane fields was the worst fate a servant could imagine. It was a life of unrelenting brutality and an early, anonymous grave in the mud. Isabelle gasped, her face draining of all color. "You wouldn't," she whispered, horrified. "You are not a monster." "He belongs to us, Isabelle," Eleonora replied, her gaze still locked on Samuel, a chilling smile touching her lips. "And I would rather see him destroyed than see him in your arms." This was the moment of irreversible change. The fire of their so-called love, so twisted and selfish, had finally erupted into a blaze that would consume them all. Eleonora's love was so possessive, she would rather see Samuel dead than see him possessed by another. Isabelle's love was a fantasy, so fragile it had led him to the brink of a living hell. Samuel looked from one sister to the other, at Isabelle's horrified, helpless face, and at Eleonora's mask of cold, vengeful victory. In their eyes he saw the terrible, damning truth. They had never loved him. They had only loved what he represented, a vessel for their loneliness, a mirror for their dreams, a weapon against each other. And now the weapon was to be broken. The dream was over. All that was left was the reckoning. The storm outside Belle Rêve raged on, but inside a new and terrible silence had fallen, heavier and more suffocating than the humidity before the rain. Eleonora's threat, her promise to sell Samuel to the living death of the cane fields, hung in the air like the smoke after a gunshot, a poison that paralyzed them all. The fragile geometry of their love triangle had shattered, leaving only the jagged, ugly shards of obsession, betrayal, and revenge. In that moment, Isabelle's romantic fantasy died a swift, brutal death, and Eleonora's desperate need for control revealed itself for what it truly was, a capacity for monstrous, unfeeling cruelty. Eleonora, having delivered her final, devastating blow, did not linger to gloat. She turned with a chillingly calm demeanor, the rustle of her stiff dress loud in the sudden quiet. "See to the lamps, Samuel," she said over her shoulder, the command a casual, brutal assertion of her power, as if she hadn't just sentenced him to death. "We wouldn't want the house to be dark for my journey tomorrow." She walked out of the conservatory, taking the light with her, leaving them in the flickering gloom. Isabelle crumpled into a nearby wicker chair, her body racked with silent, helpless sobs. Her dream had led Samuel not to freedom, but to a death sentence. She was a heroine in a story that had just ended in tragedy, and she was utterly powerless to write a new ending. Samuel did not move. He stood in the center of the room, the rain lashing against the glass, the thunder rumbling in the distance like the drums of a coming war. He looked at the weeping girl who had offered him a fantasy she could not fulfill, and at the empty doorway through which the woman who had promised him destruction had just walked. The fire that had been kindled in him was no longer one of conflict or fear. It was a cold, clear flame of pure, final clarity. They had shown him the truth.
In their world, his life, his body, his soul were nothing more than pieces in their game. And he had decided, with the terrifying certainty of the condemned, that he would not let either of them win.
He walked out of the conservatory, his footsteps silent on the damp floorboards, leaving Isabelle to her useless tears. He did not go to the lamps. He moved with a new, deliberate purpose through the darkened halls of the house that had been his entire world and was now his prison. He went to the kitchen first, his movements precise and unhurried. From a hook by the hearth, he took down a long, sharp cane knife, its heavy blade gleaming dully in the dim light. It was a tool of the harvest, now repurposed for a darker reaping. Then he turned and walked towards the study. Eleonora was at her desk, bathed in the warm glow of the lamp she had carried. A fresh glass of sherry sat near her hand, and a look of grim, satisfied resolve was on her face. She was writing a letter. To Mr. Dubois, no doubt, detailing the strong buck she would be bringing to market. She looked up as Samuel entered, a faint, triumphant smile touching her thin lips. "Have you come to beg, Samuel?" she asked, her voice dripping with cold amusement. "It will do you no." She never finished the sentence. He moved with a speed and violence that was utterly alien to the obedient, quiet boy she thought she owned. He was across the room in 2 strides, one hand clapping over her mouth to stifle the scream before it was born, the other raising the heavy blade. Her eyes, wide with shock, and then stark, unbelievable terror, were the last things he saw. It was not an act of passion. It was a reckoning, as swift, cold, and final as the fall of a guillotine. He left her there, slumped over her desk, the unfinished letter of sale soaking in a pool of spreading crimson that stained the ledger of her life red. He did not look back. He walked through the house one last time, the cane knife held loosely at his side, a dark pendulum swinging with each step, and returned to the conservatory. Isabelle was still there, her weeping having subsided into a state of numb, hollow despair. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and swollen, a flicker of desperate hope sparking in them. "Samuel, what can we do?" she whispered, still clinging to the we of her broken fantasy. He stood before her, and in the flash of lightning she finally saw him. Not the romantic hero of her novels, not the gentle boy who read her poetry, but a stranger. His face was a calm, unreadable mask, and in his hand he held the knife. The dark stain on the blade was unmistakable. Her eyes widened in confusion, then dawning, horrific realization. "Eleonora, she will not be selling me," Samuel said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion, a chilling echo of the storm. "She will not be selling anyone, ever again." The truth of his words, the monstrous reality of what he had done, settled over Isabelle like a shroud. She stared at him, her mind refusing to comprehend it. The boy she had claimed to love, the soul she had tried to set free with her poetry, had become a killer. And her selfish, foolish love had been the catalyst. "You were right, Miss Isabelle," he continued, his voice a dead monotone that was more terrifying than any shout. "You saw the man I could be." He took a step closer, and she shrank back into the chair, paralyzed by terror. "You both did. She saw a tool that could be broken to her will. You saw a hero in a story that you could write. You were both wrong." He knelt down, so his face was level with hers, his dark eyes boring into her soul. "I am not a story. I am not a tool. I was just a boy, and you have turned me into a ghost." He did not harm her. That was not part of his reckoning.
His final act was one of devastating, poetic justice. He rose, turned his back on her, and walked to the conservatory door. He threw it open to the raging night, the wind and rain instantly invading the room, scattering leaves and petals across the floor. He turned back to her one last time, framed by the chaos of the storm. "This beautiful dream," he said, gesturing to the decaying house around them, "is yours now. All yours. You and your sister can have it forever." And with that, he walked out into the storm and vanished into the impenetrable darkness of the Louisiana night, leaving only the open door and the howling wind behind him. The next morning, the authorities found a scene of true Gothic horror. Eleonora Devereaux was dead in her study, a victim of the very brutality she had threatened to inflict on another. Isabelle Devereaux was found in the conservatory, alive but completely catatonic, her mind shattered by the weight of the tragedy. She sat staring at a single dried drop of blood on a withered jasmine petal, lost in a world where her romantic fantasies could no longer reach her. Samuel was gone. He was never seen again, becoming another whisper in the Louisiana swamps, a ghost story told to frightened children, a legend of a boy who walked into a storm and never walked out. The mystery was, for the town, simple. A servant had gone mad, murdered one mistress, and driven the other insane before fleeing. But the truth was far more complex, a tragedy written in the invisible ink of human desire. The reckoning at Belle Rêve was not the act of a single night of violence. It was the culmination of a love so possessive and a fantasy so selfish that they became indistinguishable from hate. The sisters had shared a servant boy until they both fell in love, not with him, but with what he represented for them. They saw him as a mirror for their own desires, and in the end, they shattered the mirror and were cut to pieces by the shards. Belle Rêve was left to rot, a true haunted house, not by the ghost of the boy who vanished, but by the memory of the two sisters who destroyed each other over a love they never truly understood. It stands today, if it stands at all, as a testament to a chilling truth. The most dangerous cage is not one made of iron bars, but one built from another person's dreams. Where are you listening from tonight? Because some say the past never truly sleeps. It just waits for someone to remember.